Well, this morning I'd like to begin with a poem or a prayer titled Being a Sabbath People. This is it. How frightened we are by a Sabbath, Jesus. How afraid that if we stop, we'll fall behind, we'll have less than we want, we'll lose out to those who don't stop. How driven we are to protect ourselves, to hoard what we can get, to rise above the crowd, and how wounded we are and our world have become because we have forsaken the wisdom of Sabbath. Teach us again how to be Sabbath people, Jesus, how to trust you for our daily bread, how to resist the urge to accumulate and hoard, how to defy the pressure to have more, be more, do more. Teach us to dance to the rhythms of your reign, Jesus, to work meaningfully and rest peacefully, to enjoy shamelessly and share generously, to love abundantly and include indiscriminately. Teach us that the small daily Sabbath choices we make, to trade fairly and consume responsibly, to treat all others with dignity and respect, liberate us from the crippling weight of greed and fear, and heal those whose lives are bent and broken from Sabbathlessness. Amen. Teach us to dance to the rhythms of your reign, Jesus, to work meaningfully and rest peacefully, to enjoy shamelessly and share generously, to love abundantly and include indiscriminately. As I was thinking about this morning's readings and the prayer I just read to you, I was reminded of a song brought about, I think by Graham Kendrick some years ago, called Teach Me to Dance to the Beat of Your Heart. And the lyrics of that song say, teach me to dance to the beat of your heart. Teach me to move in the power of your spirit. Teach me to walk in the light of your presence. Teach me to dance to the beat of your heart. You wrote the rhythm of life, created heaven and earth. In you is joy without measure, so like a child in your sight, may I dance to see your delight. How might we move to the rhythm of God's heart? How might we dance or live in or in tune, in sync with God? Henry Thoreau once said, if a man loses pace with his companions, perhaps it's because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. Whose drumbeat do you listen to or keep pace with? I'm not sure if God has a favourite rhythm, whether God prefers the two-step, a march or waltz or boogie, but I am sure, because we see it in the scriptures and in the life and ministry of Jesus, that if we move to the heart of God's, to the beat of God's heart, it will often be contrary to the beat of the world. Following in the footsteps of Jesus often involves walking or dancing to the beat of a different drum. And that beat will often take us beyond our comfort zones, as we see with Jeremiah in our first reading. When God called Jeremiah and told him, before you were born, I consecrated you and appointed you a prophet to the nations, Jeremiah basically responded with, no way, God. I don't know how to speak. I'm just a boy. And God responded more or less with, don't say that. Just do what I say. Don't be afraid. I'll be with you. I've got your back. Jeremiah heard the beat of a different drummer to which the world followed, and despite his initial reluctance, he adjusted his step and it made all the difference. Sometimes we have to step away from the beat of the world and adjust our steps to God's, like Jeremiah did. And we too, like he, may think, God, I'm just a woman. I'm just a child. I'm just an old man. Or you fill in the gap. And God says, you're mine. I've got you. I've got you. I've called you. The beat of the world is work more, earn more, get more, you're number one, just worry about you, you deserve you got this, build a bigger barn, eat, drink, be merry. But contrary to the rhythm of the world that we could liken to Rossini's overture from William Tell on Speed. Do you know Rossini? Is that how you say it? Rossini's overture from William Tell? You'll know it when I can't sing it, of course, because it's an orchestra, but it sort of goes something like that, something like that. You hear it in the cowboy movies, in the car chase movies, and it's this fast, high-packed, frenetic sort of music. And that often is the world's rhythm. But God's rhythm is so significantly different. It has a different tempo. It has a much more intentional, often slower and seasonally appointed tempo. We get a hint of it, I think, in the seasons: summer, autumn, winter, spring. Each arrives in its time, not ours. God's rhythm is heralded in creation. We see it in the opening of a flower bud, in the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly, and the slow unfolding of its wings. In God's rhythm, every pause is pregnant with potential and purpose. Every beat, every stance is fashioned with love, a love that lingers like the sweet aroma of perfume and brings with it joy and freedom and hope. God has a rhythm, and it's set to the beat of God's heart. And we see it this morning in our gospel reading. Jesus is at the synagogue, we heard, teaching. It's the Sabbath, and a woman appears, a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. And Jesus calls her over. He calls her over. That in itself quite struck me when I read it, because it doesn't say he went to her. It says he calls her over. So there's this call theme again that we see in Jeremiah. And obviously the woman, though bent over and crippled for 18 years, responds to that call, which, who knows, may have been quite difficult given her condition. But she goes, and her obedience is rewarded, if you like, because Jesus lays hands on her, and immediately, we read, she stood up straight and began praising God. Immediately, this woman who had been bent over for 18 years stood up straight and began joining in the heavenly anthem of praise that's always being lifted up to God. It's a momentous occasion, but not all are happy about it. Not all are rejoicing. The leader of the synagogue, we hear, was indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. How incredibly sad to not be able to rejoice at God's work, to not see the good and the wonderful that's right before your eyes, to be so obsessed by following the letter of the law that you totally miss the spirit or the heart of it. The woman was miraculously healed, set free to participate in life. And yet here is this synagogue leader bound with such a miserly spirit that he couldn't share in the joy. The whole language in these few verses in Luke chapter 13 is about freedom and binding, and what it means to live as a Sabbath people, and what it means to dance to the beat of a different drum, to dance to the beat of God's heart in the world. The practice of Sabbath is about realignment. It's about taking ourselves out of a self-focused human system of accumulation and self-protection and placing ourselves under the influence of God's rhythms, God's priorities, and God's direction. It's not about just having a day off to get back into the fray of life, but about living in sync with God and God's values. Jesus said, I've come to bring life, abundant life. He said, I've come to seek and save the world, not to condemn the world. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. The Sabbath is a time of release, a life-giving, peace-filling time. What the crippled woman experienced was actually the freedom of what the Sabbath is and meant to be. She was released from that which bound her, and the fact that she was released on the Sabbath is precisely the point of the Sabbath. In this gospel reading this morning, we find Jesus confront the strict and rigid application of tradition. Don't each of you, he says, untie your donkey on the Sabbath and give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, be set free from her bondage on the Sabbath? A daughter of Abraham, he calls her. That's a strong statement that places her in God's community. This woman was not just a woman bent over. Jesus identified her as a daughter of Abraham, a woman who belonged to the community of God's people, a woman who belonged within the tradition of God's people. But this is not how a woman of her stature was seen by her contemporaries, nor was it how the disabled were seen at that time, or women in general, or the poor, or the uneducated, or the sick. The synagogue ruler is someone who wants to actually desperately please God. He wants to obey all the laws that he's been taught. Yet in all of his zeal, sadly, he has no idea actually what the law is really for. He thought it was all there to constrain people, when in fact it was there to set people free. And this thinking of so many of the religious leaders in Jesus' day created a constant conflict between them and Jesus. This whole story brings a very timely message to us in our context today. Last week, very sadly, a group called GAFCON, which identifies as Anglican, officially launched what they're calling the Southern Cross Diocese, a breakaway diocese which has been established basically because they hold a very conservative view around human sexuality, male leadership, and divorce. As I see it, GAFCON appears to be born out of a very similar motivation to that of the synagogue leader in this passage. And my heart breaks for them, for like the synagogue ruler, it seems that they're so bound that they're unable to rejoice in the work of the Spirit and the heart of God. Nor are they able to see groups of people who have previously been closeted, shamed and constrained as sons and daughters of Abraham, for whom Jesus came to bring good news of freedom and blessing. To extend Sabbath peace beyond previously drawn borders is sadly a hard thing for some religious people to do and accept. And yet that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus enacted Sabbath on the Sabbath, but the synagogue leader couldn't see it. And likewise, some still don't see it. Hence the situation that we have today with GAFCON and this latest schism, which is far from Anglican. So the bottom line, what does all of this say to us? Well, one thing I think it says is how important is it for us and Christians throughout all the ages to ask God to keep examining our hearts and to show us if and when we become spiritually bound and miserly like the synagogue ruler. Secondly, it asks us maybe to think, do we have religious practices that achieve the opposite of their original design? Are our actions, doctrines, words keeping people away rather than drawing them near? We can never stop asking those questions. And we must remember that whenever we gather, the disabled woman will be here with us. And so too will be the synagogue ruler. In fact, they may be both inside our own very conflicted hearts. For their sake, we must be a community of compassion and welcome and grace. And we must be a community soaked in the truth of the scriptures, always asking ourselves if the God we say we serve is the God revealed in Jesus. There are all sorts of restricted and constrained people in our world, including us at times. We're all before the one whose centre is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. May we all experience the Sabbath of God's healing, release, justice, and hope. Amen.